1889, Montana Territory. When rancher Thomas Brennan opened his door expecting the mail-order bride he'd sent for, he found Sarah Mitchell standing there with 6 ragged orphans clinging to her skirts, children she'd promised on her deathbed. Friends she'd never abandon. Most men would have sent them all packing on the next train east. But Thomas looked at those 7 terrified faces and said 5 words that changed everything. "I ordered one. I'll keep all 7. But could a hardened cowboy who'd spent 15 years alone on the frontier really become a father to 6 broken children overnight? Or would his ranch become just another place they didn't belong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the 3-week journey west, but none of her imaginings had prepared her for the reality of standing on Thomas Brennan's porch with 6 pairs of eyes boring into her back and the weight of an impossible promise crushing her chest. The ranch sprawled before her. In the late afternoon sun, a main house of weathered timber, a barn that had seen better decades, corrals stretching toward distant hills painted gold and purple by the Montana sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. It was also absolutely nothing like the cramped Philadelphia boarding house where she'd spent the last 3 years of her life, watching her savings dwindle and her options narrow to a pinpoint. Thomas Brennan answered her knock within seconds, as if he'd been waiting by the door. He was tall. She'd expected that from his letters, but the photographs he'd sent hadn't captured the way his presence seemed to fill the entire doorframe, or how his eyes, the color of a winter river, could look both kind and cautious at the same time. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples, and his hands, when he removed his hat in greeting, were calloused and scarred from years of ranch work. "Miss Mitchell," he said, and his voice was deeper than she'd imagined, roughened by weather and solitude. "I'm glad you made it safely." "The journey from Philadelphia, Mr. Brennan," Sarah interrupted, because there was no point in pretending, no benefit in drawing this out. "I need to tell you something before we go any further." She stepped aside, revealing what she'd been blocking with her travel-stained skirts. 6 children stood in a ragged line on his porch, ranging in age from 4 to 12, their faces smudged with train soot and their eyes huge with exhaustion and fear. They clutched their meager belongings in bundles and carpet bags, and they looked exactly like what they were, orphans who'd been passed from place to place so many times they'd stopped believing anywhere could be home. Thomas Brennan's face went carefully blank. Sarah had seen that expression before on the face of every landlord, every potential employer, every person who'd taken one look at her situation and decided it was too complicated, too much trouble, too far outside the bounds of normal charity. "This is Emma," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. She placed her hand on the shoulder of the oldest girl, a thin 12-year-old with brown braids and her mother's determined chin. "And Jacob, he's 10. The twins are Henry and Hannah, they're 8. That's little Margaret, she's 6. And this is Samuel. He just turned 4 last month." The silence stretched so long that Sarah heard a meadowlark calling from somewhere in the grass, heard the creak of the windmill turning lazy circles in the breeze, heard the pounding of blood in her own ears. "I sent for one woman," Thomas finally said, and his voice was carefully controlled, giving nothing away. "Not a woman and half a dozen children. I know." Sarah lifted her chin, meeting his eyes directly. "And I understand if you want to send U.S. back. I have enough money for tickets as far as St. Louis. We can manage from there." It was a lie. She had $17.32 to her name, and that wouldn't get them halfway to St. Louis, let alone back to Philadelphia. But she'd learned long ago that people respected dignity more than they respected desperation, and she'd be damned if she'd begged this stranger for mercy when she'd already prepared herself for rejection. "Their mother was my best friend," Sarah continued before Thomas could respond. Catherine and I grew up together. When she got sick last year consumption, she made me promise I'd keep her children together. Their father died in a factory accident 2 years ago, and Catherine, she worked herself into the ground trying to provide for them. By the time I realized how bad the consumption had gotten, it was too late. Sarah's throat tightened, but she pushed through. She died 3 months ago. The city wanted to split the children up, send them to different institutions. I couldn't let that happen. I took them in, but I was barely keeping myself fed on a seamstress's wages. When I saw your advertisement for a mail-order bride, I thought. She stopped, realizing how it sounded. How calculated. How mercenary. You thought you'd solve your problem by making it mine. Thomas finished, but there was no anger in his voice. Just a flat, tired observation. I thought, Sarah said carefully, that a ranch would need workers, and that children grow into workers. I thought the West had more room for people who didn't fit into neat categories. I thought maybe, just maybe, a man who was lonely enough to send for a stranger might understand what it means to not have anywhere else to go. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. I wrote you a letter explaining everything. I meant to send it before we left Philadelphia, but I was afraid you'd wire back, telling us not to come. So I put it in my pocket, and I told myself I'd give it to you in person, and you could make your decision with us standing right in front of you instead of being words on a page. You could just throw in the fire. She held out the letter, but Thomas didn't take it. He was looking at the children, his gaze moving from face to face. Emma stood rigid, her jaw clenched, ready to fight or flee. Jacob had his arm around little Samuel, who was sucking his thumb. Despite Emma's earlier scolding, the twins stood pressed together like two halves of a whole, and Margaret, sweet Margaret, with her missing front teeth and tangled red curls, was staring at Thomas with an expression of such desperate hope that Sarah wanted to scoop her up and run before that hope could be crushed. "How long since they've eaten?" Thomas asked abruptly. Sarah blinked, thrown by the question. "We had bread and cheese this morning at the station in Billings. Before that, supper last night on the train." Thomas nodded once decisively and stepped back from the door. "Kitchen's through there," he said, gesturing toward the back of the house. "I've got beef stew from yesterday that'll heat up quick. Bread's in the box by the stove. Coffee's hot if you want it, and there's milk in the cold cellar." Sarah stared at him. "Mr. Brennan, we'll talk after they've eaten," he said firmly. "I don't make decisions about people's futures on an empty stomach, and I sure as hell don't expect children to stand on my porch wondering if they're about to be turned out while their bellies are growling." He looked at the children again, and this time his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I'm Thomas," he said. "You're on my ranch now, and on my ranch we follow 2 rules. Don't spook the horses, and don't go hungry when there's food. To be had, come on inside." Vemma looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. One by one, the children filed past Thomas into the house, their eyes wide as they took in the main room with its massive stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and animal pelts on the walls. It smelled like wood smoke and leather and coffee. Essentially masculine and utterly foreign to children who'd spent their lives in cramped city quarters. Sarah moved to follow them, but Thomas caught her arm gently. His hand was warm through the thin fabric of her sleeve, and she felt that warmth all the way to her bones. "That letter," he said quietly. "I don't need to read it. You just told me everything I need to know." "And what's that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish, and I'm not sure yet which one it is." He released her arm and stepped back. "But I meant what I said. We'll talk after the children are fed. Some conversations shouldn't happen with an audience." Sarah nodded and followed the children inside, her mind reeling. She'd prepared herself for anger, for rejection, for being sent away on the next train. She hadn't prepared herself for kindness, however cautious. Kindness was more dangerous than rejection, because kindness made you hope. And hope was the coolest thing of all when you'd learned not to trust it. The kitchen was large and surprisingly clean for a bachelor's domain. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, and a scarred wooden table that could seat 8 took up the center of the room. Thomas moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire in the stove and setting a massive pot of stew to heat. He sliced bread with a knife that looked sharp enough to shave with, and he poured milk into tin cups without spilling a drop. The children watched him with a mixture of wariness and hunger, and Sarah saw the exact moment they decided he might not be a threat when he set a cup of milk in front of little Samuel and said, "Had a pup once who wouldn't drink unless someone told him it was all right. You remind me of him. It's good milk. You can drink it." Samuel looked at Emma for permission. Emma looked at Sarah. Sarah nodded. Samuel drank, and the spell was broken. Within minutes, all 6 children were eating like they'd been starving for weeks, which wasn't far from the truth. Sarah had been rationing their food for the last leg of the journey, trying to make her dwindling money last out. Thomas didn't eat. He stood with his back against the counter, his arms crossed, watching the children with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. She picked at her own bowl of stew, which was surprisingly good, and tried not to think about what would happen when this meal was over and decisions had to be made. "The oldest is 12? Thomas asked quietly, pitching his voice so the children wouldn't hear over their eating. "Emma, yes. She's sharp as a tack and twice as tough. She practically raised the younger ones after Catherine got too sick to manage. And the boy, Jacob, quiet, but he's good with his hands. He can fix almost anything. His father taught him before." Sarah stopped, not wanting to say "before he died" where the children might hear. Thomas nodded. "The little one, Samuel. He seems small for 4. He was premature. Catherine worried he'd never catch up, but he's stronger than he looks." Sarah set down her spoon, unable to pretend to eat anymore. "Mr. Brennan, I know this isn't what you signed up for. If you want us to leave, I ordered one," Thomas interrupted, his eyes still on the children. "I'll keep all 7. Sarah's breath caught. "What?" Thomas finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her chest ache, a loneliness so deep and so old that it had carved canyons into his soul. "I've been alone on this ranch for 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years since my family died cholera back in '74. My wife, my 2 daughters, both under 5 years old. This house has been empty, except for me, for longer than some of those children have been alive." He paused, his jaw working as if the words were fighting him. "I sent for a bride because I'm 42 years old, and I'm tired of eating alone. Tired of talking to horses because they're the only ones around to listen. Tired of going to bed in a house so quiet you can hear the stars moving across the sky. I told myself I wanted companionship, someone to share the work and the years." Thomas looked back at the children, Emma helping Samuel cut his bread, Jacob making the twins laugh with a funny face, Margaret leaning against Sarah's side like a small, exhausted bird. But maybe what I really needed was to remember what it's like to have a house full of noise and chaos and life. Maybe I needed to remember that a home isn't about quiet. It's about being needed. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't know these children. You don't know what you're taking on. Emma has nightmares. Jacob hasn't spoken a full sentence since his father died. The twins, they're inseparable, and if you try to separate them, they'll both spiral. Margaret still waits the bed sometimes. Samuel sucks his thumb, and I imagine he'll stop when he feels safe enough not to need it," Thomas finished. "And I imagine they all have ghosts they're carrying, just like every person on this earth who's lived long enough to lose something they loved. That doesn't make them broken. That makes them human." He pushed off from the counter and crossed to the table. 6 pairs of eyes looked up at him, wary and wondering. Thomas Brennan, the rancher who'd ordered a mail-order bride and gotten a family. Instead, looked back at them with an expression that was equal parts determination and terror. "I'm going to say this once," he told them, his voice steady and sure. "You're home now. This is your ranch, your house, your family. I don't know the first thing about raising children, and I'll probably make 100 mistakes before supper tomorrow, but I know how to work hard, how to keep my word, and how to stand by the people under my roof. If you can live with that, we'll figure out the rest as we go." Emma spoke for the first time since arriving, her voice hoarse and suspicious. "Why? You don't know us. Why would you do this?" Thomas met her eyes, this fierce, frightened girl who'd had to grow up too fast, and answered with a truth that cut through every defense. "Because 15 years ago, someone might have done it for me if I'd been young enough to need it. Because your mother made a promise to keep you together, and Sarah here has been breaking her back trying to honor it. And because sometimes people don't need a reason to do the right thing. Sometimes they just need the chance." The silence that followed was different from before. It was fragile and cautious, like the first green shoots pushing through frozen ground in spring. It was the silence of children who'd been disappointed so many times that they'd stopped believing in adults who kept their promises. But it was also, Sarah thought as she watched Thomas Brennan meet each child's gaze in turn, the silence of something beginning. Something that might, with enough time and care and sheer stubborn determination, grow into something real. "Their sleeping quarters. Upstairs," Thomas said, breaking the moment before it could become too heavy. 3 bedrooms besides mine. We'll sort out who sleeps where after you've all had a chance to wash up. There's a pump in the yard, and I've got soap and towels in the mudroom. Sarah, you'll take the room at the end of the hall. The children will figure it out." He paused, then added with the faintest hint of what might have been humor, "Fair warning. This house hasn't had children in it for a long time. I don't have toys or books or anything much besides work and more work. If that's not what you were hoping for, now's the time to say so." Jacob, the quiet 10-year-old who rarely spoke, surprised everyone by saying, "We're good at work." Thomas looked at him, and Sarah saw the rancher's expression soften into something almost like respect. "Then I expect we'll get along just fine." And in that moment, standing in Thomas Brennan's kitchen with 6 exhausted orphans and a mail order bride arrangement that had just become infinitely more complicated, Sarah allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Fragile, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd all found what they'd been searching for. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains by the time Sarah finished helping the children wash and settle into their rooms. Thomas had been right about the house not being prepared for children. The bedrooms were sparse, containing little more than beds with straw mattresses, rough wool blankets, and a single dresser in each room. But after months of sleeping 3 and 4 to a bed in her cramped boarding house quarters, the children seemed almost overwhelmed by the luxury of space. Emma and Margaret claimed the smallest bedroom. The twins took the middle one, and Jacob insisted on sharing with Samuel, though Sarah suspected it was more about the 10-year-old not wanting to be alone than any desire to room with a 4-year-old. She'd found them sitting on the edge of the bed together, Jacob's hand resting protectively on Samuel's shoulder, both of them staring at the walls as if trying to convince themselves this was real. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her own room was at the far end of the hall, and when Sarah finally closed herself inside, she leaned against the door and allowed herself to shake. The enormity of what had just happened crashed over her like a wave. They were staying. Thomas Brennan had looked at her desperate situation, at 6 children who weren't his responsibility, and he'd said yes. She didn't understand it, didn't trust it, but she also didn't have anywhere else to go, so she straightened her spine, smoothed her hair, and went back downstairs to face whatever came next. Thomas was in the main room, adding logs to the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the lines around his eyes and the silver in his dark hair. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "They settled?" he asked finally. "As much as they can be in a strange place." Sarah clasped her hands in front of her, suddenly aware of how improper this was her. Alone with a man she'd just met in his house at night. "Mr. Brennan, I need to understand what is happening now. You said we could stay, but we haven't discussed terms. I don't expect charity. I can work, I'm an excellent seamstress, and I can cook and clean and manage a household. The children can help with ranch work as they're able. We'll earn our keep." Thomas straightened from the fireplace, brushing bark from his hands. "I sent for a wife, not a housekeeper." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We barely know each other." "No, we don't." He moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a cut crystal decanter that looked wildly out of place in the rustic room. He offered her one, and when she hesitated, he said, "It's been a long day. This'll help." She took the glass but didn't drink. Thomas settled into a leather chair worn soft with age and gestured to the chair across from him. Sarah sat, perching on the edge like a bird ready to take flight. "Here's what I'm thinking," Thomas said, his voice low and measured. "We got ourselves into an unusual situation, and we need an unusual solution. I still need a wife. This ranch needs a woman's touch, and I'm tired of my own company. You need security for yourself and those children. What I'm proposing is we go ahead with the original plan marriage, but we take our time with the rest of it." Sarah's fingers tightened on her glass. "I'm not sure I understand. I mean, we get married legally, proper and official, but we give ourselves time to figure out if we suit each other as more than business partners. You'll have your own room. No expectations beyond running the household and helping raise those children into decent people. In the meantime, we get to know each other. Maybe in a year, maybe 2, we'll want more from this arrangement. Or maybe we won't. But at least you'll have legal protection and a home that can't be taken away on a whim." It was the most practical proposal Sarah had ever heard, and also the strangest. "You'd marry me without the usual marital arrangements?" "Yes." Thomas took a drink of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been alone a long time. Sarah, I'm not fool enough to think we can build something real out of desperation and convenience. If this is going to work, if we're going to make a real family here, it has to be built on choice, not obligation." Sarah finally sipped her whiskey, feeling it burn down her throat. "And if I decide I can't be what you need? If the children are too much trouble, or are not suited to ranch life, then we cross that bridge when we come to it." Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But I'll tell you something true. I've spent 15 years building this ranch with my own 2 hands. I've survived blizzards that killed cattle by the hundreds, droughts that turned the grass to dust, and a loneliness that would have driven a weaker man to drink or worse. I don't scare easy, and I don't quit when things get hard. If you give this an honest try, I'll do the same." Sarah studied his face, looking for deception or hidden motives. She'd learned in Philadelphia that kindness always came with a price. But all she saw in Thomas Brennan's Winter River eyes was a bone-deep weariness and a hope he was trying very hard not to show. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll try." Thomas nodded once, as if they'd just sealed a business deal rather than agreed to alter the entire course of their lives. "Town's 5 miles east. There's a preacher there, Reverend Walsh. We'll ride in tomorrow, make it official. I'll need to file papers at the land office anyway. Get your name added to the deed as my wife." "That's not necessary." "It is." His voice was firm. "This ranch is yours too, soon as we say our vows. Half of everything. That's how marriage works in Montana Territory, and that's how it'll work here. You're not going to be dependent on my goodwill. You're going to be my legal partner." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she'd been carrying. So long she'd forgotten it was there. Security, legal protection. A home that couldn't be taken away by a landlord or a judge or anyone else who decided she wasn't respectable enough to deserve one. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas stood abruptly, as if the emotion in the room had become too much for him. "It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day getting married, getting supplies in town, figuring out how to turn a bachelor's ranch into a place fit for children." Sarah rose as well, setting her half-finished whiskey on the side table. "Mr. Brennan." "Thomas." He met her eyes. "If we're getting married tomorrow, you'd better start calling me Thomas." "Thomas." His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her aware of every inch of space between them. "I won't let you down. The children and I will work hard. We'll make this worth your while." Something flickered across his face, an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Just make it feel like a home again. That's all I'm asking." He left her, standing there, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he climbed to his own room. Sarah waited until she heard his door close before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the vast Montana darkness, broken only by stars so numerous and bright they seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere out in that darkness, her old life was receding like a train pulling away from a station. Philadelphia, Catherine's deathbed. The desperate scramble to keep the children fed and together. The moment she'd seen Thomas Brennan's advertisement and made the wildest gamble of her life. And here, in this rough ranch house that smelled of wood smoke and leather, a new life was beginning. One she hadn't planned for. One that included 6 traumatized children and a widower rancher who looked at her like she was both a solution and a mystery he needed to solve. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass and allowed herself one moment of pure terror. Then she straightened, smoothed her skirts, and went upstairs to check on the children. One last time before bed. Morning came with a rooster's crow and the realization that Sarah had slept better than she had in months. The bed, while simple, was comfortable, and the silence of the ranch, so different from the constant noise of the city, had lulled her into a dreamless sleep. She dressed quickly in her best dress, a deep blue cotton that Catherine had helped her sew 2 years ago. It was worn at the cuffs and had been mended twice, but it was clean and respectable, and it would have to do for a wedding dress. The children were already awake when she went to check on them. Emma had somehow managed to wrangle everyone into relatively clean clothes, though Samuel's shirt was on backward and Margaret had lost one of her hair ribbons. "Are we really staying?" Hannah asked, her small hand clasped tight in Henry's. "He's not going to send us away." Sarah knelt to her level. "We're really staying. Mr. Brennan and I are getting married today, which means this is your home now, legal and official." "What if he changes his mind?" Jacob asked, voicing the fear they were all thinking. "He won't." Sarah tried to sound more confident than she felt. "Thomas Brennan strikes me as a man who keeps his word. But I need you all to understand this is a working ranch. He's going to expect us to pull our weight. That means helping with chores, learning ranch work, being respectful and responsible. Can you do that?" 6 heads nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Emma looked determined. Jacob looked resigned. The twins looked curious. Margaret looked hopeful. And Samuel just clutched the stuffed rabbit Catherine had made him before she died. "All right then." Sarah stood and smoothed her skirts. "Let's go down for breakfast. And remember best behavior." Thomas was already in the kitchen, frying eggs and bacon on the massive stove. He'd shaved and changed into clean clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a leather vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. He looked, Sarah realized with a flutter of nervousness, quite handsome when he wasn't covered in trail dust and worry. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's hot. Eggs'll be ready in a minute." The children filed in silently, taking seats at the big table. Sarah moved to help, but Thomas waved her off. "Sit. This is the last meal I'll cook as a bachelor. Might as well enjoy the novelty." He served breakfast with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown the night before, eggs and bacon for everyone. Toast slathered with butter, more milk for the children. He set a cup of coffee in front of Sarah, and their fingers brushed briefly. She felt that touch all the way to her bones. They ate in near silence, the only sound the scrape of forks on tin plates and the crackling of the fire in the stove. It should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. It felt almost comfortable, like a family that had been together long enough not to need constant conversation. "After breakfast, we'll hitch the wagon," Thomas said, breaking the quiet. "Towns. Not far, but with 7 of us, we'll need the wagon instead of horses. We'll see the preacher first, then stop at the general store for supplies. I'm thinking we need to outfit you all with proper clothes, something more suited to ranch life than city living." "I can pay for the children's things," Sarah said quickly. "I have some money, save it." Thomas's tone left no room for argument. "You're about to be my wife. Providing for the family is my job." Nina, who'd been silent up until now, spoke up. "We're not your charity case." Thomas turned his full attention to her, and Sarah held her breath. Emma had been Catherine's daughter through and through, fierce, proud, unwilling to bend. She'd been the one who fought the city officials who wanted to separate them, who'd stood between her siblings and every threat, who'd never once cried even when Sarah knew her heart was breaking. "No," Thomas agreed calmly. "You're not a charity. You're family. There's a difference. Family helps each other without keeping score. You'll work hard on this ranch, I'll see to that. But I'll provide what you need to do that work. That's not charity, that's common sense." Vima held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, it was the closest thing to approval Thomas was likely to get from her, and Sarah saw him recognize it as such. He turned back to his breakfast, and the moment passed. An hour later, they were all cleaned up and loaded into the wagon, a sturdy farm wagon with wooden seats and sides, high enough to keep the smaller children from tumbling out. Thomas drove, Sarah beside him on the bench seat, the 6 children arranged in the back, with blankets to sit on. The ride to town took them through the country that stole Sarah's breath. Rolling hills stretched endlessly, covered in grass that swayed like an ocean in the breeze. Distant mountains rose purple and white against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Cattle dotted the landscape, and once, Sarah saw a herd of pronghorn antelope racing across the horizon, faster than any creature had a right to be. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Thomas glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You think so?" "Most city folk find it too empty. Too much space, not enough people. Most city folk haven't lived in a boarding house where you can hear your neighbors' every conversation through the walls. Space sounds like paradise." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Wait until winter. When the snow's so deep you can't see the fences and the wind cuts through you like a knife, you might feel differently about all this space. Maybe." Sarah looked back at the children, who were pointing at cattle and arguing about whether the horses pulling the wagon were brown or bay. "But I think we'll manage." The town of Cedar Falls was small, a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a white steeple, a general store, a saloon, a bank, and scattered houses. People stopped to stare as Thomas drove the wagon down the main street, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn under the scrutiny. "Don't mind them," Thomas said quietly. "They're just curious. News spreads fast in a small town, and me bringing home mail-order bride and 6 children is going to be the talk of the county for months." He pulled the wagon up in front of the church, a simple white building with a bell tower and flower boxes beneath the windows. A man in his 50s with a kind face and thinning gray hair was sweeping the front steps. "Thomas Brennan," the man called out, his face lighting up with surprise. Wasn't expecting to see you in town on a weekday. What brings you?" He stopped, his eyes going wide as he took in the wagon full of people. "Good Lord, Reverend Walsh." Thomas climbed down and helped Sarah descend, his hands steady on her waist. "I need you to perform a marriage, today, if you're willing." The Reverend's gaze moved from Thomas to Sarah to the 6 children staring out of the wagon with wide eyes. "Well," he said slowly, "this is unexpected. Maybe you'd better come inside and explain what's going on here." Thomas looked at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw the question. "Are you sure?" She nodded once. She'd come too far, risked too much to turn back now. "Let's make this official," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And with 6 orphans as witnesses and a surprised but willing reverend." Sarah Mitchell prepared to become Sarah Brennan, wife to a rancher she'd known for less than a day, stepmother to children who weren't hers by blood, but were hers by choice. Sometimes, she thought as she followed Thomas and the Reverend into the church, family wasn't about being born into the right circumstances. Sometimes family was about finding each other in the wilderness and deciding to hold on tight. No matter what came next, the church interior was cool and dim, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows that painted colored patterns across worn wooden pews. Reverend Walsh led them to the front, his expression shifting between bewilderment and something that might have been approval as he watched the children file in behind Thomas and Sarah. "I've been the reverend of this church for 23 years, Walsh said, pulling out the registry book where marriages were recorded. "I've married young couples barely old enough to know their own minds, old widowers looking for companionship, and everything in between. But I'll admit, Thomas, this is a first." Thomas didn't smile, but Sarah caught the slight relaxation around his eyes that suggested amusement. "I've always liked being memorable." Walsh turned to Sarah, his gaze sharp. "But not unkind, Miss Mitchell, is it? You understand what you're agreeing to here. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not something to be entered into lightly. And from what I'm gathering, you've known Thomas all of what, a day?" "Less than a day," Sarah admitted. She could feel the children watching her, especially Emma, whose dark eyes missed nothing. "But I understand what marriage means, Reverend. I'm not a foolish girl with romantic notions. I'm a woman who needs to provide for 6 children, and Mr. Brennan has offered us a home and protection in exchange for partnership. That seems more honest than most marriages I've witnessed." The Reverend's bushy eyebrows rose. "Well, that's certainly direct." He looked at Thomas. "And you're prepared to take on not just a wife but 6 children? Children who've already lost their parents, who'll need more than just food and shelter." "I wouldn't have brought them here if I wasn't." Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "I know what loss looks like, Reverend. I know what it means to need a home and not have one. These children need stability, and I can provide that. Sarah needs security, and I can provide that too. Seems to me that's a better foundation than most marriages start with." Walsh studied them both for a long moment, then sighed. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, and I suppose this is one of them." "Very well. Do you have witnesses?" "We have 6, Sarah said, gesturing to the children who'd arranged themselves in the front pew like a small, ragged congregation. The Reverend's stern expression finally cracked into a smile. "I suppose you do at that. All right then, let's begin." The ceremony was brief and practical, stripped of romance, but not without solemnity. Reverend Walsh spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about duty and respect and building a life together through hard work and faith. He asked Thomas if he would take Sarah as his lawfully wedded wife, to protect and provide for her all the days of his life. Thomas looked at Sarah when he answered, his Winter River eyes steady and sure. "I will." When Walsh asked Sarah the same question, she felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on her back, 6 children whose futures depended on her answer. She thought of Catherine, her best friend who'd made her promise to keep these children together. She thought of the impossible task she'd been facing, trying to raise them on a seamstress's wages in a city that had no mercy for the poor. She thought of Thomas Brennan, who'd looked at her desperate gamble and said yes when any reasonable man would have said no. "I will," she said clearly. Thomas produced a simple gold band, his mother's. He told her quietly, one of the few things that survived the cholera epidemic that had taken his family. Sarah's hands trembled as he slid it onto her finger, but his hands were steady, warm and calloused and real. "By the power vested in me by Montana Territory and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife," Walsh declared. He looked at Thomas with an expression that was half expectation, half mischief. "You may kiss your bride," Sarah's breath caught. They hadn't discussed this part. Thomas must have seen the panic in her eyes, because he leaned in slowly, giving her time to object, and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to her forehead instead of her lips. It was over in a heartbeat, but Sarah felt the warmth of that kiss long after he'd stepped back. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," Walsh said, writing their names in the registry with a flourish. "May the Lord bless your union and all the children under your care." Margaret, who'd been remarkably quiet throughout the ceremony, suddenly piped up, "Does this mean we're Brennans too?" The adults turned to look at the 6-year-old, who was gripping the pew in front of her with white-knuckled intensity. "Because Emma said we couldn't take a new last name without asking our mama first. But our mamas go. Robert Mitchell sounds like he was a good father." Thomas glanced at the other children. "And your mother was Catherine Mitchell, who loved you enough to make sure you'd stay together even after she was gone. Those are good names, important names. You should be proud to carry them." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But here's what I'm thinking. Out here on the ranch, people are going to know you as the Brennan children. That's just how small towns work. You live on Brennan land, you'll be called Brennans. But that doesn't erase who you were before. You can be both. You can honor your parents and still be part of this new family. Does that make sense?" Emma stood up from the pew, her thin frame rigid with emotion. "We're Mitchells," she said fiercely. "We'll always be Mitchells." "Yes," Thomas agreed, still kneeling by Margaret, but directing his words to Emma. "You will. And I'd never ask you to forget that. But you're also going to be living on my ranch, eating my food, learning my trade. That makes you Brennans too, whether you take the name officially or not. Family isn't just about what you're called. It's about who shows up for you when things get hard." Emma stared at him, her jaw clenched tight, fighting tears she'd probably been holding back for months. Finally, she said, "Our father showed up for us every single day until he couldn't anymore. Our mother worked herself to death trying to keep us fed. Don't you dare act like we didn't have family before you came along." "I'm not," Thomas said quietly. He rose to his feet but didn't move toward Emma, respecting the distance she needed. "I'm saying you've had more family than most children ever. You've had parents who loved you fiercely, and you've got each other. All I'm offering is to add to that, not replace it. But if you'd rather keep yourselves separate, if you'd rather think of this as a business arrangement where you work for your keep and nothing more, I'll respect that too. The choice is yours." The silence in the church stretched thin and fragile. Sarah held her breath, watching Emma wrestle with pride and grief and the terrifying possibility of hope. The other children watched their oldest sister, waiting for her verdict, and Sarah realized that whatever Emma decided would set the tone for all of them. Jacob broke the stalemate. He stepped forward and stood beside Emma, his young face serious. "Papa used to say that being stubborn was good when you were fighting for something that mattered, but stupid when you were fighting just to prove you could. I think ... I think we're fighting just to prove we can." He looked up at Emma, his voice cracking slightly. "I miss Pa. I miss Mama so much it feels like I can't breathe sometimes. But they're gone, Em. They're gone and we're here, and Mr. Brennan." He turned to Thomas. "You could have sent us away. You didn't have to let us stay. That means something. Emma's facade finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she scrubbed at them angrily with the back of her hand. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I'm so tired of being strong and holding everyone together and pretending like I know what I'm doing." Sarah moved then, crossing to Emma and pulling her into a fierce embrace. The 12-year-old resisted for exactly 3 seconds before collapsing against her, sobbing like the child she still was beneath all that armor. "You don't have to hold everyone together anymore," Sarah murmured into Emma's hair. "That's not your job. Your job is to be 12 years old. To learn and grow and make mistakes and have someone older catch you when you fall. Let us be adults. Please." The other children clustered around them, Jacob wrapping his arms around both Sarah and Emma, the twins pressing close, Margaret hugging Emma's waist, and even little Samuel patting Emma's leg with his small hand. They stood there in the front of the church, a knot of grief and exhaustion and desperate hope, while Thomas and Reverend Walsh watched from a respectful distance. When Emma finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clearer than Sarah had seen them in months. She looked at Thomas. "I don't know if I can call you Pa, not yet, maybe not ever." Your father was Robert Mitchell," Thomas said firmly. "I'm Thomas Brennan. Those are different people, different names. You call me whatever feels right, and if that's just Thomas, that's fine by me." Emma nodded slowly. Then, in a voice so quiet Sarah almost missed it, she said, "Thank you for saying yes, for not sending us away." Thomas's expression softened in a way Sarah hadn't seen before, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been. Before loss carved him into something harder. "You're welcome. Now what do you say we get out of this church and go do something about feeding all of you? Growing children need more than one meal a day, and I'm fairly certain we're past lunchtime." The practical suggestion broke the emotional tension, and the children rallied with surprising speed. Reverend Walsh handed Thomas the marriage certificate, shook both their hands with genuine warmth, and promised to visit the ranch soon to see how they were all settling in Dot as they filed out of the church into the bright afternoon sunlight. Sarah caught Thomas's arm. "That thing you did back there," with Emma giving her permission to keep her father's memory separate, not forcing them to replace their parents, "that was wise." Thomas looked uncomfortable with the praise. It was just the truth. Children aren't blank slates you can write new stories on. They come with their own stories already written, and if you try to erase those, you'll lose them entirely. "How did you learn that?" Sarah asked. His jaw tightened. "Hard experience. After my wife and daughters died, people kept telling me I was young enough to start over, to have a new family, to replace what I'd lost. As if love was something you could just swap out like a worn-out pair of boots. Every time someone said it, I wanted to break something. It took me years to realize they weren't trying to be cruel. They just didn't understand that you don't replace people you love. You just learn to live with the empty spaces they leave behind." He met her eyes, and Sarah saw depths of pain she hadn't fully comprehended before. Those children have empty spaces shaped like Robert and Catherine Mitchell. Nothing I do will ever fill those spaces. But maybe, if we're lucky and we try hard enough, we can build something new in the spaces around them. Something good enough that the emptiness doesn't hurt quite so much. Sarah's throat tightened. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Thomas Brennan. Don't canonize me yet," he said dryly. "Give it a week. Once you see me trying to cook breakfast for 7 people, while managing ranch work and dealing with 6 children who have no idea how to live in the country, you'll revise that opinion quickly." Despite everything, the strangeness of the day, the enormity of what they'd just done, the uncertainty of the future, Sarah laughed. It felt good, like stretching muscles that had been clenched too long. They loaded back into the wagon, and Thomas drove them down the main street to Walker's General Store, a large establishment that seemed to sell everything from nails to bolts of fabric to penny candy. The proprietor, a barrel-chested man named George Walker, greeted Thomas with obvious curiosity. "Heard you drove through town with a wagon full of people," Walker said, leaning on his counter. "Don't tell me you finally went through with that mail-order bride business." "I did," Thomas gestured to Sarah. "George Walker, meet my wife, Sarah Brennan." "Sarah, George runs the best general store in 3 counties. Mostly because he runs the only general store in 3 counties. Walker laughed and extended a meaty hand to Sarah. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, Mrs. Brennan. And who are all these young folks?" "Our children," Thomas said, and Sarah noticed he didn't qualify it with adopted or step. Just our children, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "They're going to need outfitting for ranch life. Sturdy clothes, proper boots, winter coats. We'll need bedding 2 sheets, blankets, pillows, and probably a few other things I haven't thought of yet." Walker's eyes went wide at the size of the order, but he rallied quickly, the businessman in him recognizing a substantial sale. "Well, now let's get started. Children, come over here by the dry goods, and we'll get you measured up properly." For the next hour, the store was a flurry of activity. Walker's wife, Martha, appeared from the back room and took charge of the girls, measuring them for dresses and skirts while clucking over how thin they were. George handled the boys, outfitting them with sturdy canvas pants, flannel shirts, and boots that would hold up to ranch work. Thomas moved through it all with quiet efficiency, approving purchases, adding items to the order, never once questioning the mounting cost. Sarah watched him pile blankets and sheets on the counter, saw him pause at a display of books and add 3 primers and a McGuffey reader to the stack, noticed him slip peppermint sticks into his pocket when he thought no one was looking. This was costing him a small fortune, and he was approaching it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Thomas," she said quietly, catching his arm, "this is too much. We don't need—" "Yes, we do." His tone was gentle but immovable. "Winter comes early and hard out here. Those children need warm clothes and proper bedding, or they'll freeze. They need books if you're going to teach them, and they need supplies for daily living. This isn't extravagance. This is a necessity." He paused, then added with the faintest hint of humor, "Besides, I've been banking my profits for 15 years with no one to spend them on. Might as well put the money to good use." When they finally loaded the wagon with their purchases, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. The children were exhausted, but wearing their new clothes with obvious pride. Jacob in canvas pants and a blue flannel shirt that made him look almost grown. Emma in a practical brown dress with a white apron. The twins in matching outfits that delighted them. Margaret in a green dress that brought out the red in her hair. And Samuel in miniature ranch wear that made him look like a tiny cowboy. Thomas helped Sarah into the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist a moment, longer than necessary. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Brennan?" Mrs. Brennan, her new name, her new life. Sarah looked at the 6 children settled in the back of the wagon, at the supplies that represented Thomas's investment in their future, at the small town that would become their community, and finally at the man who'd gambled everything on a family of strangers. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the morning journey, exhaustion catching up with all of them. The children dozed against each other in the back, lulled by the rhythm of the wagon. Sarah sat beside Thomas, watching the landscape roll past, and thought about the vows she'd spoken just hours ago, for better or worse, in sickness and health. "Till death do us part." She'd meant them, even if she barely knew the man beside her. She'd meant them because she had 6 children depending on her, because she had nowhere else to go, because Thomas Brennan had shown her more kindness in one day than she'd experienced in the last year combined. But somewhere between the church and the general store, between Emma's tears and Thomas's quiet wisdom, between the moment he'd slipped peppermint sticks into his pocket for children who weren't his, and the way he'd called them our children without hesitation, somewhere in all of that, Sarah realized her reasons for meaning those vows had shifted. She wasn't just doing this for survival anymore. She was doing it because maybe, just maybe, Thomas Brennan was exactly the kind of man worth building a life with. The kind who kept his promises. The kind who understood that broken things could heal if you gave them time and patience, and didn't try to force them into shapes they weren't meant to hold. As the ranch came into view, the house dark against the sunset-painted sky, Sarah Brennan allowed herself to believe in something she'd stopped believing in months ago. The possibility of home. The first week on the Brennan ranch taught Sarah more about herself than the previous 30 years combined. She learned that she was stronger than she'd believed, capable of hauling water from the well, kneading bread dough until her arms ached, and managing a household twice the size of anything she'd handled before. She learned that Montana mornings were so cold they made her teeth chatter even in September, and that the silence of the prairie at night was louder than any city noise had ever been. Most importantly, she learned that Thomas Brennan was a man of peculiar contradictions. He woke before dawn every morning and had coffee brewing by the time Sarah came downstairs. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending cattle, fixing the 100 small things that constantly broke on a working ranch. He was quiet to the point of being taciturn, often going hours without speaking unless spoken to first. Yet every evening, he sat with the children after supper and listened to their stories about their day with the kind of focused attention Sarah had rarely seen from any adult. He was also, she discovered, utterly hopeless at certain domestic tasks. "Thomas," Sarah said on the fourth morning, watching him attempt to crack eggs into a pan while simultaneously burning bacon and somehow getting flour in his hair, "let me handle breakfast. Please." He looked at her with something that might have been relief. "I've been cooking for myself for 15 years. You'd think I'd be better at it by now." "You've been surviving for 15 years, Sarah corrected, taking over the stove with practiced efficiency. "There's a difference between survival and actually living. Go check on the children. Make sure Jacob's not trying to lift things too heavy for him. He has his father's stubborn pride. And ensure Samuel's actually wearing both boots before he goes outside." Thomas hesitated, as if uncertain about being dismissed from his own kitchen, then nodded and headed toward the stairs. Sarah heard his heavy footsteps overhead, heard Jacob's voice raised in protest about something, heard Thomas's low rumble. In response, despite the chaos of 7 people learning to live under one roof, it felt right in a way Sarah hadn't expected. The children were adjusting with varying degrees of success. Emma had appointed herself Sarah's second-in-command, helping with cooking and cleaning with the grim determination of someone who'd been doing adult work since she was 9. Jacob shadowed Thomas everywhere, soaking up knowledge about ranch work with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. The twins had discovered the barn cats and spent hours trying to tame the half-feral creatures, coming back scratched but happy. Margaret followed Sarah like a small chatty shadow, asking endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether Montana had any kings or queens. Samuel was the one who worried Sarah most. The 4-year-old had barely spoken since they'd arrived, communicating mostly through gestures and the occasional whispered word to Jacob. He still sucked his thumb constantly, and he'd wake screaming from nightmares at least twice a night. Sarah would rush to his room, heart pounding, to find him sitting bolt upright in bed, tears streaming down his face, unable to articulate what had frightened him. On the 5th night, she found Thomas already there, sitting on the edge of Samuel's bed with the little boy curled in his lap. Thomas was singing, his voice rough but not unpleasant, an old folk song about a mockingbird. Samuel's thumb was in his mouth, but his eyes were drooping closed, the tension slowly leaving his small body. Sarah stood in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. When the song ended and Samuel's breathing evened into sleep, Thomas carefully laid him back down and tucked the blankets around him. He turned and saw Sarah, and something passed between them in the dim light, an understanding. That they were both learning how to do this, both making it up as they went, both terrified of failing these children who'd already lost so much. "My mother used to sing that to me," Thomas said quietly, following Sarah out into the hallway. "When I had nightmares about storms or wolves or whatever children fear in the dark. I haven't thought about it in years." "It was beautiful," Sarah said. "He needs that gentle handling. He's so young, and he doesn't understand why his mother isn't coming back." Thomas leaned against the wall, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "None of them understand it, not really. Emma pretends she does, but she's 12. Jacob's trying to be the man his father was, but he's 10 years old and he shouldn't have to carry that weight. Even the older ones, they know their parents are dead, but knowing something and accepting it are different things entirely." He looked at Sarah, his Winter River eyes shadowed in the lamplight. "I see myself in them sometimes. See that lost look I had after my family died. Took me years to stop expecting to hear my wife's voice calling me for supper, or my daughter's laughter echoing through this house. Sometimes I still hear it, even though I know it's just the wind or my own imagination playing tricks." Sarah reached out without thinking and placed her hand on his arm. Through the fabric of his shirt, she could feel the warmth of his skin, the solid strength of him. "You're doing well with them. Better than most men would, thrown into fatherhood without warning." "I don't feel like I'm doing well." Thomas's voice was raw with honesty. "I feel like I'm stumbling blind through every day, hoping I don't break something that can't be fixed. Emma looks at me like I'm a problem she needs to solve. Jacob won't let himself be a child because he thinks he needs to earn his place here. The twins are so desperate for normalcy, they're pretending everything's fine when it's clearly not. Margaret asks me questions I don't have answers to, and Samuel," his voice cracked. "Samuel looks at me sometimes like he's waiting for me to disappear too. They're testing you," Sarah said gently. "Seeing if you'll stay. Seeing if this is real, or just another temporary stop before they're moved along to the next place. They've been disappointed before. They're protecting themselves." "How? Long before they believe I'm not going anywhere?" "As long as it takes." Sarah's hand was still on his arm, and neither of them moved to break the contact. "You show up every day. You keep your promises. You give them stability and patience and time. Eventually, they'll start to trust it. Start to trust you." Thomas looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "And you? Are you testing me too?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Sarah wasn't ready to examine. "Maybe," she admitted. "I've learned that people are generous when it's easy and convenient. The real test comes when things get hard. When the children are driving you mad with noise and mess and constant needs. When winter hits, we're all trapped inside together. When the novelty of having a family wears off and you're left with the reality of it. You think I'll fail that test? I think you're human. I think we're all going to have moments where we wonder what we've gotten ourselves into. But I also think," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I think you're the kind of man who made a promise and intends to keep it, even when it's harder than you imagined. That's rarer than you might think." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I'm glad you're here, Sarah, not just because of the children or the household help. I'm glad you're here." Before Sarah could respond, before she could even process what that confession meant, a door opened down the hall and Emma emerged. Her hair loose around her shoulders and her nightgown ghostly white in the dim light. "Samuel's crying again," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I heard him from my room." Thomas and Sarah both listened, but the house was silent except for the usual creaks and settles of an old building at night. "He's asleep now," Thomas said. "We just got him settled." Emma's shoulders sagged with relief, and Sarah saw how thin the girl's reserves truly were. She'd been playing the role of surrogate mother for so long that she didn't know how to let anyone else take over. But the strain of it was written in the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her young shoulders. "Go back to bed, Emma," Sarah said gently. "Thomas and I will listen for him. You don't have to be responsible for everyone anymore." "But what if we handle it?" Thomas interrupted, his voice kind but firm. "What if you let yourself be 12 years old for a night and trust the adults to do the adult work?" Emma looked between them, clearly torn between relief and the habit of vigilance that had kept her siblings safe through the worst months of their lives. Finally, she nodded and retreated to her room, closing the door with a soft click. "She'll wake up anyway if he cries again," Sarah predicted. "It's going to take time before she can let go of that responsibility." "Then we'll be patient," Thomas said. "Time is one thing we have plenty of out here." The next morning brought their first real crisis. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard shouting from the barn. She ran outside, her heart in her throat, to find Thomas holding Jacob back from one of the ranch hands, a grizzled cowboy named Pete Holloway who'd worked for Thomas for 3 years. "Don't care what the hell you think." "Boy," Holloway was snarling, "you don't know the first damn thing about horses, and I'm not about to let some city brat tell me how to do my job." "I saw you hit him," Jacob shouted, struggling against Thomas's grip. His face was flushed with anger and tears of frustration. "You hit Thunder with that crop, and he didn't deserve it." "Jacob, enough," Thomas said firmly, but Sarah could hear the tension in his voice. He looked at Holloway, and his expression went cold in a way Sarah hadn't seen before. "Is it true? Did you hit the stallion?" Holloway spat in the dirt. Horse was being stubborn. "Sometimes they need discipline." "I don't use crops on my horses," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You know that. I've made that clear since the day you started working here. With respect, boss, you've been managing this place alone for so long, you've forgotten how to properly train animals. A little discipline never hurt. Get off my property." The words fell like stones into still water. Holloway stared at Thomas, shock evident on his weathered face. "What? You're fired. I want you packed and gone by noon." Thomas's grip on Jacob loosened, and the boy stumbled forward but stayed quiet, watching with wide eyes. "Any man who thinks hitting an animal is acceptable doesn't work on my ranch. And any man who talks to a child that way uses that language, that tone, doesn't belong around my family." "Your family?" Holloway's laugh was ugly. "That mail-order woman and her pack of orphans? You've lost your mind, Brennan. You're running a charity house, not a ranch. And when winter comes and you realize what a mistake you've made, don't come crying to me for help. I won't need to. Now get out." Holloway stalked off toward the bunkhouse, cursing under his breath. Thomas watched him go, then knelt down in front of Jacob, who was trying very hard not to cry. "You did the right thing," Thomas said quietly. "Standing up for an animal that can't defend itself, that takes courage. But Jacob, you can't charge at a full-grown man when you're angry. He could have hurt you badly before I got there." "He was hurting Thunder," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "And Thunder's the gentlest horse I've ever met. He didn't deserve to be hit. No, he didn't. And Holloway's going to face consequences for his actions. But you need to understand something." Thomas placed his hands on Jacob's shoulders, making sure the boy was looking at him. "You're not responsible for protecting everyone and everything on this ranch. That's my job. When you see something wrong, you come get me. You don't try to handle it yourself. Understood?" Jacob nodded miserably. I couldn't stand there and watch. Pa always said that good men don't look away when someone's being hurt. Your pa was right about that. Good men don't look away. But good men also know when to get help instead of charging in alone." Thomas pulled Jacob into a brief, gruff hug. "You've got your father's courage, son. Now you need to learn his wisdom too. Sarah saw Jacob's face when Thomas called him son, saw the flash of pain and longing, and cautious hope that crossed the boy's features. Thomas seemed to realize what he'd said, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he didn't take it back. Didn't apologize or explain it away. He just released Jacob and stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. Go tell Sarah what happened. She want to know you're all right. Then come find me in the south pasture. I need help checking the fence line, and I could use someone with sharp eyes. Jacob nodded and ran toward Sarah, who'd been watching from the porch. She caught him in her arms, feeling the trembling in his small frame, and held him until the adrenaline stopped making him shake. Thomas fired Pete, Jacob said into her shoulder. Because of me. Because Pete broke ranch rules and disrespected you, Sarah corrected. That's not your fault. That's Pete making poor choices and facing the consequences. But now Thomas is short-handed. He needed Pete for the winter work. Sarah looked over Jacob's head at Thomas, who was standing by the barn watching them. Even from a distance, she could see the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man preparing for a fight. He'd just fired an experienced ranch hand 2 months before winter, all because that hand had hit a horse and spoken harshly to a child. It was going to make his life considerably harder, and he'd done it without hesitation. Thomas will manage, Sarah said firmly. He's been managing this ranch for 15 years. What he won't manage is having people around who hurt animals or disrespect children. He made his priorities clear, and I'm grateful for it. Jacob pulled back and looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. He called me son, I heard. Do you think he meant it? Or was it just something people say? Sarah thought about Thomas sitting with Samuel in the middle of the night, singing lullabies he'd learned from his own mother. She thought about the way he'd defended Emma's right to keep her father's memory separate. She thought about the gentleness in his hands when he'd slid his mother's wedding ring onto Sarah's finger. I think, she said carefully, that Thomas Brennan doesn't say things he doesn't mean. He called you son because that's what you're becoming. Maybe not right away, and maybe not in a way that replaces your real father. But you're his son now too, in the ways that matter. In the ways he can control. Jacob processed this, his young face serious beyond his years. I think I'd like that. Being his son, I mean. If he really wants me. He wants you, Sarah said with certainty. He wants all of you. Now go wash your face and then find him in the south pasture. He needs you, and you need to learn the work if you're going to be a rancher someday. You think I could be? A rancher? I think you could be anything you set your mind to. But yes, I think you'd make a fine rancher. Jacob's smile was tentative but real, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since they'd boarded the train in Philadelphia. He ran off to clean up, and Sarah turned her attention to the barn where Pete Holloway was loading his belongings onto a horse with angry, jerky movements. Thomas caught her looking and walked over, his expression unreadable. I know what you're thinking. Do you? You're thinking I just made a rash decision that's going to bite me come winter. That I let emotion override good business sense. Sarah crossed her arms. Actually, I was thinking that you're a better man than I gave you credit for. Again, it seems to be becoming a habit. Thomas blinked, clearly thrown. I don't follow. You chose the children over convenience. You chose principles over practicality. You made it clear that this family, our family, comes first, even when it costs you. Sarah met his eyes, willing him to understand what she was trying to say. That means something, Thomas. That means everything. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw the same cautious hope she'd seen in Jacob's. The hope of someone who'd been alone so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like to be chosen. To matter, to be someone's priority. I should get to that fence line, he said finally. His voice rough. Jacob's going to be waiting. Thomas, he paused, looking back at her. Thank you. For protecting him. For protecting all of them. They're mine to protect now, he said simply. That's what family does. He walked away, and Sarah stood on the porch watching him go. Her hand unconsciously touching the gold band on her finger, his mother's ring. A symbol of a marriage that had started as a business arrangement, but was becoming something else entirely. Something real. Something that felt dangerously close to what Sarah had stopped believing in after Catherine died. A future worth hoping for. 3 weeks into their new life. Margaret came down with a fever that turned Sarah's blood to ice water. The 6-year-old had been complaining of a sore throat at breakfast, but by midday she was burning up. Her small face flushed and her eyes glassy with delirium. Sarah sat beside Margaret's bed, wringing out cool cloths and pressing them to the girl's forehead while her mind raced through terrible possibilities. Influenza, scarlet, fever, diphtheria, all the diseases that killed children with terrifying regularity, especially out here where the nearest doctor was a half-day's ride away. "Mama," Margaret whimpered, not fully conscious. "Mama, my throat hurts." Sarah's chest constricted. She smoothed Margaret's sweat-dampened hair back from her face. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Emma stood in the doorway, her face pale and stricken. "Is she going to die?" The blunt question hit Sarah like a physical blow. "No," she said firmly, though fear clawed at her throat. "She's going to be fine. It's probably just a cold that's settled in her chest. That's what they said about Mama at first." Emma's voice was flat, emotionless, but Sarah heard the terror underneath. "They said it was just a cold. Then it was consumed, and then she was gone." Sarah wanted to offer reassurance, but she'd learned in Philadelphia that children who'd watched their mother die weren't comforted by easy lies. "Your mother was sick for months before the consumption took her. Margaret's been healthy until this morning." "That's different." "But you don't know." "No, I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I know how to bring down a fever, and I know Margaret's strong. Now either help me or go downstairs, but don't stand there imagining the worst." Emma came into the room, her movements jerky with barely controlled panic, and took over wringing out cloths while Sarah tried to get Margaret to drink willow bark tea. The little girl fought her, turning her head away and crying weakly. "Please, Margaret," Sarah coaxed. "Just a few sips. It'll help your throat feel better." "It tastes bad," Margaret whimpered. "I know it does. But sometimes the things that help us don't taste good. Just try, let me." Sarah turned to find Thomas in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his face creased with worry. She hadn't heard him come up the stairs. He crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, bringing himself to Margaret's eye level. "Hey there, little miss. I hear you're feeling poorly." Margaret's eyes focused on him with difficulty. "My throat hurts real bad, I bet it does." Thomas took the cup of tea from Sarah's hands. "You know what I used to do when I was a boy and had to drink medicine I didn't like? I'd pretend I was a brave knight drinking a magic potion that would give me the strength to fight dragons. Made it easier to get down." "There's no such thing as dragons," Margaret said, but there was a hint of interest in her voice despite the fever. "You sure about that?" "Because I've seen some things out on the range that looked an awful lot like dragons to me. Big lizards with scales and sharp teeth. We call them mountain cats, but I reckon they're really dragons in disguise." Despite her misery, Margaret managed a weak smile. "You're making that up." "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm telling you a secret that most grown-ups have forgotten." Thomas held the cup to her lips. "One sip for courage. Can you do that?" Margaret took a tiny sip, grimaced, but swallowed. "That's good. Now another sip, this one for strength." Sip by sip, using the silly game, Thomas coaxed Margaret into drinking half the cup of willow bark tea, more than Sarah had managed in 20 minutes of trying. When the little girl finally turned her head away, refusing more, Thomas set the cup aside and felt her forehead with a work-roughened hand that was surprisingly gentle. "She's burning up," he said quietly to Sarah. "How long has she been like this?" "Since noon." It came on fast. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm writing for Doc Harrison. He's in Clayton, but I can be there and back by midnight if I push hard." "Thomas, that's a 4-hour ride each way. And it's already late afternoon. I'm not sitting here watching a child suffer when there's a doctor within reach." His voice was firm, brooking no argument. "You keep doing what you're doing with the cool cloths and the tea. Emma, you help Sarah. Jacob can handle evening chores with the twins. I'll be back with the doctor before you know it." He stood, then paused and looked down at Margaret, his expression softening. "You hang on, little dragon slayer. I'm going to get someone who knows more about fighting fevers than any of us. Can you be brave for me?" Margaret nodded weakly, and Thomas bent down and kissed her forehead, a gesture so natural and paternal that Sarah's throat closed with emotion. Then he was gone, his boots thundering down the stairs, and moments later Sarah heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Emma stared after him, her hands still clutching a wet cloth. "He's really going? In the dark? That trail's dangerous at night." "He's going," Sarah confirmed, adjusting Margaret's blankets. "Because that's what fathers do. They move heaven and earth when their children need them." "He's not our father," Emma said automatically. But the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. Sarah looked at the 12-year-old. This fierce girl who'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will for so long that she'd forgotten how to bend. Maybe not by blood. But Emma, he just kissed Margaret's forehead and called her his little dragon slayer. And now he's riding 8 hours through the night to fetch a doctor for a child he's known for 3 weeks. What do you call a man who does that? Emma's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't know what to call it. I don't know how to," her voice cracked. "What if she dies anyway? What if he rides all night and the doctor can't help and we lose her too?" "I can't, Sarah. I can't lose anyone else." Sarah crossed to Emma and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You're not going to lose her. Margaret's going to be fine. But Emma, you need to hear me. Even if the worst happened, even if we lost someone we loved, you wouldn't be alone anymore. You have me. You have Thomas. You have your brothers and sisters. You don't have to carry every burden by yourself." Emma clung to Sarah and finally let herself cry deep. Wrenching sobs that came from a place of grief so profound that Sarah felt her own tears start to fall in sympathy. They stood there in Margaret's room, holding each other while the little girl dozed fitfully and the afternoon light faded to evening dot when Emma's tears finally subsided. She pulled back and wiped her face with her sleeve. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. You should have done that weeks ago," Sarah said firmly. "Crying doesn't make you weak, Emma. It makes you human. And you've been trying to be superhuman for far too long." Emma managed a watery smile. "Can I stay here? With you and Margaret? I was hoping you would." They settled in for the long wait, Sarah and Emma taking turns with the cool cloths, trying periodically to get Margaret to drink more tea, monitoring her fever for any change. Jacob checked in every hour, his young face tight with worry. The twins came up once, took one look at Margaret's flushed face, and fled back downstairs where Samuel was mercifully asleep and oblivious to the crisis. The hours crawled past. Margaret's fever climbed higher despite their efforts, and she began mumbling incoherently, calling for her mother, for her father, crying about things that made no sense. Sarah's own panic mounted with each degree of temperature, but she forced herself to stay calm for Emma's sake. It was past 11 when they finally heard hoofbeats, not one horse but two. Sarah's head snapped up. "He's back." Heavy footsteps on the stairs, and then Thomas was there with a man Sarah assumed was Doc Harrison, a thin, gray-haired gentleman with kind eyes and a black medical bag. Both men looked exhausted, covered in trail dust, but Thomas's eyes went immediately to Margaret. "How is she?" "Worse," Sarah admitted. "The fever's still climbing. She's been delirious for the past hour." Doc Harrison was already at the bedside, pulling out instruments and examining Margaret with practiced efficiency. He looked in her throat, listened to her chest, felt the glands in her neck. After what seemed like an eternity, he straightened and turned to face them. "It's Quinsian abscess in the throat. Painful as all hell, pardon my language, but not immediately life-threatening if we treat it properly." He was already mixing something in a small bottle. "This is going to be rough for the next day or two. The fever will break, but she's going to feel worse before she feels better. I'll need to stay and monitor her, make sure the abscess doesn't get worse." The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense it made her dizzy. "She's going to be all right. She's going to be fine, Mrs. Brennan. Your husband did the right thing, fetching me. Left untreated, Quincy can become serious. But caught this early, with proper care, she recover fully." Harrison looked at Thomas with approval. "That was quite a ride you made. Trails treacherous at night." "Had to be done," Thomas said simply, but Sarah saw his hands shaking slightly as he removed his hat. The fear he'd been carrying for 8 hours was written in every line of his body. Harrison stayed through the night, administering medicine and teaching Sarah how to continue the treatment. By dawn, Margaret's fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 18 hours. Emma had fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head pillowed on her arms. And Doc Harrison was dozing in the corner. Sarah found Thomas on the front porch, sitting on the steps and watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink. He looked haggard, his face drawn with exhaustion, but he straightened when he heard her approach. "She's better," Sarah said softly, settling beside him on the steps. "The fever broke about an hour ago. Doc Harrison says she'd be back to her normal self in a few days." Thomas's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank God. You saved her life. If you hadn't ridden for the doctor, don't." His voice was rough. "Don't thank me for doing what any father would do." Sarah looked at him, this man who'd married her out of loneliness and practicality, who'd taken on 6 traumatized children without hesitation, who'd ridden 8 hours through dangerous terrain in the dark because one of those children needed help. "You keep calling them yours." "The children. You called Margaret your little dragon slayer. You called Jacob's son." Emma noticed. "They are mine," Thomas said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. "Maybe not by blood or law, but they're mine just the same. I chose them, and they're starting to choose me back, and that makes us family in the ways that count. And me?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it. "What am I to you?" Thomas turned to look at her fully, and in the dawn light, his Winter River eyes were warm in a way she'd never seen. "You're my wife. My partner. The woman who trusted me enough to gamble everything on a stranger's promise. I don't have fancy words for what that means to me. Sarah, I just know that somewhere between you showing up on my porch with 6 children and this moment right here, this stopped being a business arrangement." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it now?" "I don't know yet." His honesty was devastating and beautiful at once. "But I'd like to find out, if you're willing." Sarah thought about the past 3 weeks, the way Thomas sang lullabies to Samuel, the way he'd defended Jacob against Pete Holloway, the way he'd played silly games to get Margaret to drink her medicine, the way he'd ridden through the night without hesitation because a child needed him. She thought about the gold ring on her finger and the vows she'd spoken in a church with 6 children as witnesses, for better or worse. In sickness and in health, she'd meant those vows when she'd said them, but she'd meant them as a contract, a promise to fulfill her end of a bargain. Now, watching the sunrise with this exhausted, honest, impossibly good man beside her, Sarah realized the vows had transformed into something else entirely, into truth. "I'd like that too," she said softly. Thomas reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and solid around hers. They sat together on the porch steps as the sun rose over Montana, painting everything gold. And Sarah Brennan allowed herself to believe in something she'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of love. Margaret's recovery marked a turning point for the family. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in the way they all related to each other. The children stopped testing quite so much, stopped waiting for Thomas to prove himself unreliable. Emma began seeking Thomas's opinion on household matters instead of just Sarah's. Jacob started calling the ranch home instead of Mr. Brennan's place. The twins began including Thomas in their elaborate games involving the barn cats and imaginary adventures. Even Samuel showed progress. The nightmares didn't stop entirely, but they became less frequent. And occasionally Sarah would find the little boy sitting with Thomas in the evenings, nestled against his side while Thomas read from one of the primers they'd bought in town. The work was constant and exhausting. Thomas hired 2 new ranch hands to replace Pete Holloway Younger, men who were patient with Jacob's endless questions and didn't mind when the twins were underfoot while they worked. Sarah fell into a rhythm with the household chores, and Emma proved to be genuinely helpful rather than just grimly determined to prove her worth. One evening in mid-October, Sarah was cleaning up after supper when she heard music coming from the main room. She dried her hands and peeked around the doorframe to find Thomas at an old piano she hadn't realized was there, half hidden under a tarp in the corner. His fingers moved over the keys with surprising grace, coaxing out a melody that was melancholy and beautiful. The children were scattered around the room, Emma mending a torn dress, Jacob working out a piece of leather he was learning to tool, the twins playing a quiet game with wooden blocks, Margaret drawing pictures with precious paper and a stub of pencil, and Samuel actually standing beside Thomas, watching his hands on the keys with rapt attention. It looked, Sarah realized with a start, like a family. Not a perfect family, not one without scars and grief and lingering pain, but a real family nonetheless, people who'd chosen each other, who were learning to trust each other, who were building something lasting out of broken pieces. Thomas looked up and saw her watching, his hands stilled on the keys. "I didn't wake anyone, did I?" "No." Sarah came into the room, drawn by the scene before her. "I didn't know you could play. My mother taught me before she died. Haven't touched it in years." Samuel asked me what was under the tarp, and I thought maybe it was time to uncover it. Samuel looked up at Thomas with something approaching worship. "Will you teach me to make the music?" Thomas's expression softened into something Sarah could only describe as tenderness. "I'd be honored to teach you, little man. But you've got to promise me something first." "What?" "Promise me you'll keep at it, even when it's hard. Learning music takes patience and practice, and sometimes your fingers will hurt and you'll want to quit. But if you stick with it, you'll be able to make beautiful sounds for the rest of your life. Deal?" Samuel considered this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old contemplating a sacred oath. Then he held out his tiny hand. "Deal." Thomas shook his hand solemnly, man to man, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple beauty of the moment. This was what healing looked like. This was what home felt like, that night, after the children were asleep, and the house had settled into its familiar nighttime creaks and sighs. Sarah found Thomas on the porch again, his usual spot for thinking and watching the stars. "You're going to freeze out here," she said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the October chill. "Winter's coming early this year, or so your ranch hands tell me. They're probably right. I can feel it in the air." Thomas didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the vast Montana sky. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "What is it?" "When Margaret got sick, when I was riding to fetch Doc Harrison in the dark, I realized something." He finally turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his eyes stole her breath. I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement or a practical solution to loneliness. I'd started thinking of you and those children as my family. Actually mine. And the thought of losing any of you, it terrified me more than anything has terrified me since the day I buried my wife and daughters. Sarah moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice. Thomas, I'm not asking you for anything, he said quickly. I know we agreed to take this slow, to give ourselves time. But I needed you to know that for me, this isn't business anymore. This is, he struggled for words. This is everything. Sarah reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the roughness of day-old stubble under her palm. For me too, she whispered. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was watching you with Samuel that first night. Maybe it was the way you defended Emma's right to keep her father's memory. Maybe it was writing 8 hours to save Margaret. But Thomas, this stopped being a practical arrangement for me weeks ago. What is it now? He asked, echoing her own question from Margaret's sickbed. Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. I think you know. Thomas covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his face. I'm falling in love with you, Sarah Brennan. Slowly and carefully, the way a man my age falls in love. But falling just the same. Good, Sarah said softly. Because I'm falling in love with you too. Slowly and carefully, the way a woman who's learned to be cautious falls in love. But falling just the same. He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her. And they stood together on the porch, under a million stars while the Montana wind whispered around them. And the house behind them held 6 children who were learning that family could be chosen. That love could be rebuilt, that broken things could heal if given time and patience and care. And somewhere in the darkness, if Sarah listened carefully, she could almost hear Catherine's voice, her best friend. Her sister in all but blood, giving her blessing to this new life, this new love. This new family built from the ashes of grief. Thank you, Sarah whispered into the night. To Thomas and to Catherine, and to whatever forces had brought her to this moment. Thank you for giving us all a second chance. Thomas kissed the top of her head, and in that simple gesture, Sarah found everything she'd been searching for, home, family, and the promise of a future worth living. Winter arrived in Montana with the subtlety of an avalanche. The first serious snow came in early November, blanketing the ranch in 2 feet of white that transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The children, who'd never experienced anything more than Philadelphia's slushy gray winters, stood at the windows in wonder, watching the world disappear under pristine whiteness. Can we go out in it? Henry asked, his face pressed against the cold glass beside Hannah's. Thomas, who was adding logs to the fireplace, looked at Sarah with raised eyebrows. She nodded, smiling. Bundle up warm. Coats, scarves, gloves, everything. And stay where we can see you from the windows. The ensuing chaos of 6 children trying to dress for a serious cold would have been comical if it hadn't been so heartwarming. Thomas helped Samuel with his boots while Sarah wrapped scarves around necks and pulled mittens onto small hands. Emma, who'd learned to anticipate everyone's needs, had lined up the winter clothes by size, making the process slightly less chaotic. When they finally tumbled outside, the children's shrieks of delight echoed across the ranch. Jacob immediately began constructing what he announced would be the world's largest snowman. The twins discovered the joy of snow angels, falling backward into drifts and waving their arms and legs with abandon. Margaret tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue, spinning in circles until she was dizzy. Even Samuel, usually so quiet and reserved, laughed as he helped Jacob roll a massive snowball for the snowman's base. Sarah stood on the porch watching them. Thomas beside her with his arm around her waist, a casual intimacy that had developed over the past weeks. They look happy, she said softly. They are happy. Thomas pulled her closer against the cold. We all are. It was true. The house that had been empty for 15 years now rang with voices and laughter. The kitchen table that Thomas had eaten at alone for so long was crowded with people at every meal. The bedrooms that had stood vacant were filled with children's drawings and mended clothes, and the evidence of lives being lived. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said, turning to face him. "I wrote to an old friend in Philadelphia last week. Someone who knew Catherine and the children. I told her we were all settled, that the children were thriving, that we'd found," she paused, searching for the right words, "that we'd found what we were looking for." Thomas's expression was unreadable. "What did you tell her about us?" "The truth. That I married a rancher who ordered one bride and kept 7 people. That you've been kinder and more patient than I had any right to expect. That the children call this home now." Sarah took a breath. "And that I've fallen completely, irrevocably in love with my husband." Thomas's face transformed, the careful control he usually maintained melting into pure joy. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Sarah Brennan, you're going to make me forget there are 6 children watching us from the yard." "Let them watch," Sarah said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Let them see what a real marriage looks like." Thomas kissed her then, not the chaste forehead kiss from their wedding day, but a real kiss that conveyed months of growing affection, respect, and love. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, they heard a chorus of reactions from the yard. "Gross," from the twins, predictably. "About time," from Emma, her voice carrying clear approval. "Does this mean you're really married now?" From Margaret. Jacob just grinned, and even Samuel was giggling behind his mittened hands. Thomas called out to them, his voice carrying across the snow. "Yes, we're really married. Have been since September, in case you forgot. Now get back to that snowman before you all freeze solid." The children returned to their play, but Sarah noticed they kept glancing back at the porch, at her and Thomas standing together, and she saw relief in their expressions. They'd needed this confirmation, needed to see that the adults in their lives were building something permanent, something that wouldn't crumble under the first real challenge. Christmas came with a fierce blizzard that trapped them all inside for 3 days. Sarah had worried the forced confinement would make everyone stir-crazy, but instead it became a gift time to simply be together without the constant demands of ranch work. Thomas taught the children to play chess and checkers using a set that had belonged to his father. Emma discovered she had a talent for it, beating Thomas soundly in their 3rd game. Jacob worked on the leather tooling project he'd started months ago, revealing it on Christmas morning as a belt for Thomas with the Brennan brand burned into the leather. The gift left Thomas speechless, and Sarah watched him run his fingers over the careful craftsmanship with something like wonder. "You made this?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "Pete showed me how before you fired him," Jacob admitted. "I've been working on it every night after you went to bed. I wanted," he stopped, suddenly shy. "I wanted you to have something from me. Something that showed I was learning the trade. That I was going to be a good rancher someday, like you." Thomas pulled Jacob into a fierce hug, and Sarah heard him whisper, "You're already good, son. You're already everything I could hope for." The twins gave Thomas and Sarah matching scarves they'd knitted with Martha Walker's Help Lumpy, uneven things that were somehow perfect. Margaret presented a drawing she'd labored over for weeks, the ranch house with all 8 of them standing in front of it, stick figures holding hands under a massive sun. Samuel's gift was simpler, but no less meaningful. He played Twinkle. Twinkle, little star on the piano, the notes hesitant but recognizable. His small face serious with concentration. Emma's gift came last. She handed Sarah a folded piece of paper, her expression nervous. "It's not much, but I thought maybe you'd want it." Sarah unfolded the paper to find a letter, written in Emma's careful script. "Dear Sarah, I've been trying to write this for weeks, but the words keep coming out wrong. So I'm just going to be honest. The way you've always been with us. When Mama died, I thought my life was over. I thought nothing would ever be good again. I was so angry at God, at the world, at Mama for leaving us, at myself for not being able to save her. I decided I wouldn't let anyone else in, wouldn't trust anyone else, because trusting people meant losing them. Then you brought us here, and Mr. Brennan Thomas said yes when he should have said no. And slowly, without me even noticing, you both started showing us what a family could be. Not perfect, not without grief or hard days, but real. I know I've been difficult. I know I fought you both on everything, tested every boundary, pushed back against every kindness. But you never gave up on us. You never made us feel like we were too much trouble or too broken to love. So this is my gift to you. I'm going to stop fighting. I'm going to let myself be your daughter, the way Jacob let himself be Thomas's son. I'm going to trust that you're not going anywhere, that this is really home. Thank you for keeping Mama's promise. Thank you for keeping us together. Thank you for loving us even when we didn't make it easy. Your daughter, Emma Brennan. Sarah couldn't see the last lines through her tears. She looked up at Emma, this fierce, brave girl who'd carried the weight of the world on her narrow shoulders for far too long, and opened her arms. Emma crossed to her and let herself be held. And for the first time since Catherine's death, Sarah felt like they were all going to be truly all right. Spring came eventually, as it always did in Montana, sudden and shocking after months of white. The prairie exploded into color, wildflowers carpeting the hills in purples and yellows and reds. The cattle grew fat on new grass, and Thomas began teaching Jacob the finer points of ranch management, treating the 11-year-old like the capable young man he was becoming. One evening in late April, nearly 8 months after Sarah had arrived with 6 orphans in tow, the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together before bed, when they'd talk about their days and make plans for tomorrow. Mrs. Patterson at the general store asked if we'd be interested in selling eggs, Emma reported. She'd taken over managing the hen house and had dramatically increased production through careful management. She says she can't keep them in stock, and ours are better than the ones from the Morrison farm. That's because you're good at what you do, Thomas said with obvious pride. If you want to start an egg business, I'll back you. Just remember to save enough for our own use. We go through a lot with this many mouths to feed. Jacob spoke up next. I've been thinking about that south pasture, the one with the rocky soil. What if we cleared the rocks and tried planting hay there? Could use it for winter feed, save money on buying from the Hendersons. Thomas considered this seriously. That's good thinking. It'd be hard work clearing those rocks, but you're right, it could be profitable. We'll start on it next week, you and me and the new hands. The conversation continued, the twins reporting on the barn cat's latest litter of kittens. Margaret describing a bird's nest she'd found. Samuel asking when he could start learning to ride a horse properly, instead of just sitting on one, while someone led it around. Sarah listened to it all, marveling at how natural this had become. How these children who'd been strangers 8 months ago were now discussing business plans and farm management like they'd been ranchers all their lives. How Thomas had transformed from a lonely bachelor into a father who knew each child's dreams and talents and fears. What about you? Thomas asked Sarah, pulling her close against his side. Any business ventures you want to launch? I was thinking about offering sewing services in town, Sarah admitted. Martha Walker mentioned several women who need help with wedding dresses and Sunday clothes. I could work from home, bring in a little extra income. You don't need to work, Thomas said, but his tone was gentle, not dismissive. We're doing fine financially. I know. But I want to contribute. I want to build something of my own, even while I'm building this with all of you. Thomas kissed her temple. Then do it. I'll support whatever you want to do. As the sun dipped below the mountains and the stars began emerging one by one, Sarah looked at her family because that's what they were now. Undeniably and irrevocably, and felt a peace she'd never known before. Emma, sitting on the porch steps with a book, glancing up occasionally to add to the conversation. Jacob, leaning against the railing beside Thomas, already mimicking his posture and mannerisms. The twins, chasing lightning bugs in the grass. Margaret, showing Samuel how to whistle using a blade of grass. All of them are here, healthy and happy and home. I was thinking, Thomas said quietly, for Sarah's ears only. Maybe it's time we added to this family. Not right away, but eventually. When you're ready. Sarah's heart stuttered. You want more children? I want whatever you want. But yes, I wouldn't mind a baby or two. Ones we make together. Ones who'll grow up with 6 older siblings who'll spoil them rotten and teach them everything they know. He paused. Only if you wanted to. Sarah thought about it. About babies born into this family, this home, this life they'd built from desperation and hope. Children who'd grow up knowing they were chosen and wanted, surrounded by love and laughter and the vast Montana sky. I'd like that, she said softly. I'd like that very much. Thomas's smile was brilliant, transforming his face into something young and joyful. He pulled her into his arms properly, right there on the porch with 6 children as witnesses, and kissed her like a man who'd found everything he'd been searching for. And Sarah kissed him back, tasting salt air and coffee and the promise of tomorrow. Thinking about the journey that had brought her here, from Philadelphia's cramped streets to Montana's endless horizons. From desperation to hope, from survival to something that felt remarkably like joy. She'd come here expecting nothing more than shelter. Instead, she'd found a family, a home, and a love she'd stopped believing existed. Thomas Brennan had ordered 1 bride. He'd kept 7 people. And in doing so, he'd given them all something infinitely more valuable than security or shelter. He'd given them a future worth living. As the stars wheeled overhead and the Montana wind whispered through the grass, the Brennan family sat together in the gathering dark. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that all of this was exactly where she was meant to be, home at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.